A carefully choreographed Russian Victory Day celebration was aimed at showing military might on Red Square this week. But as Putin presided over the parade, he had little to show for the costly winter offensive in Ukraine. Have Russians grown tired of the fighting? My guest on Conflict Zone is Nina Khrushcheva, professor of international affairs at the New School in New York and the great-granddaughter of Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev. She has spent months of the war in Moscow. As Russia prepares to face a Ukrainian counteroffensive, how shaky is Putin's position? Nina Khrushcheva, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you for inviting me.
When you spoke on this program last year, you said that exposing the shortcomings of the Russian army has caused a lot of prestige damage. How much worse is it now for Russia and Putin himself, especially on Victory Day?
Well, I think the question of prestige is no longer that relevant for Putin. The way Russia decided to continue, Putin decided to continue, is that we're not paying attention to things like that. They keep saying that the special military operation is going to be completed, it's going to achieve its goals, and it no matter how long it will take. And essentially, at this point, it seems no matter what kind of price it's going to take. So in some way, on Victory Day, they had a parade. It was somewhat subdued. It wasn't grand. It was only 50 minutes. Putin spoke for about 10. But essentially, it is a very matter-of-fact approach now. We are at war. Russia is at war. And you take it or leave it. But basically, Russia is going to be at war. And those who are not agreeing with this kind of approach are going to be eliminated.
But we've heard that numerous Victory Day parades, they've been scaled back, they've been canceled. Red Square was closed to the public since the end of April in a sign of security fears. Is it a sign of weakness for Putin? And what do you think Russians are making of it?
Well, it is, a sign of weakness, basically, not just that, but also sign of weakness that almost, not all, but almost every conceivable freedom of having rights, freedom of expression, freedom of free speech, and so on and so forth, have been almost completely scaled back, curtailed, forbidden. So that's a weakness, because weak states have very weak liberties, and Russia now has very, very weak liberties. So yes, and it is a sign of weakness from the Western perspective. But from the Russian perspective, it is a sign of strength, is that the world is against us. It's a hybrid war. NATO is getting closer and closer to our borders. We were right to begin the operation, as the Kremlin says. And therefore, no matter how Russia or Putin or Kremlin looks from the point of view of the West, they are going to push their own rhetoric. And in Russia, it is and I spoke about it, it hasn't changed. It was a great sense of despair last year, great sense of disbelief for many, many months. And now the despair and disbelief actually turned into complete just sort of surrender to the fate, and also a lot of anger against the Kremlin, but also a lot of anger against everybody who pushes Russia to that brink, as many Russians see it.
And against that backdrop, Russia has, without providing any evidence, it has accused Ukraine of attempting to assassinate Putin in a drone attack on the Kremlin. There's a lot of speculation around this incident, some saying it might have been staged as an attempt to gain sympathy at home, or potentially a false flag that might lead to something else. What do you think it was? What do you think the Kremlin strategy might be?
Well, when we start a sentence without any evidence, it's a war. There's a lot of things that both sides, or all sides involved in it, claim that has no evidence, and yet they claim. And so sides decide, which side you're on, decide who you're going to believe in. There've been a lot of conversation about Kiev actually attacking Moscow, attacking Kremlin, those leaked documents, Pentagon documents. We don't know exactly how true they are, but they've been suggestions there, and even some evidence, apparently, that Kiev did have or has had such ideas. We heard it from the Kiev authorities that, just recently, we're going to attack Russians on every territory unless Ukraine wins. So it's not without, it's not an entire speculation to say it may have been an act of the Ukrainian army. It could be a false flag, but the thing is, the false flag should be then, a lot of places canceled, but the Red Square parade remained. That's the main square. So Putin really measures it or kind of centers it around the Stalin Victory Day parades. Even in his speech today, he talked about brothers and sisters, very much like Stalin did during World War II. So it is, I think we really don't have enough information to say who did it. It could be Ukrainians, it could be a false flag, it could be sympathy. But there's certainly, for the Russians, the worse the attacks on Russia is, actually it is better for the Kremlin because it allows them to push that propaganda. The war is a war, and we did what we did in 1945. So it's no longer an offensive war. It's actually a defensive war.
And more fighting is, of course, looming. Russia and Ukraine both preparing for the next phase of the war as a Ukrainian counteroffensive looms. Putin doesn't have many victories, as you've highlighted. Ukraine's counteroffensive, meantime, will be backed by thousands of new Western-donated armored vehicles and freshly trained troops. How high are the stakes for him right now, personally?
Well, the stakes are high because it is. He began a war thinking it's going to be fast and clear and all good. It didn't happen this way. So the stakes are high because now his only way, say, to stay in power, to continue to say that I'm the only one who can protect you from Western aggression is me. So for him, actually, the war is something that is somewhat cherished politically because he needs it. He needs it. Unless he wins, he actually needs the war to continue with losses, even with losses, because there would be some gains, some losses, and Ukrainians themselves said that it would be really difficult, and certainly their Western advisors said it would be difficult for Ukraine to take back all the territory. So to some degree for Putin, the longer it continues, as long as he cannot win, the better it is for his political standing. Unless it goes so badly and so sideways, then that the elites around him and the people in Russia actually say, well, maybe we should reconsider. But I would not see that happen quite quickly or anytime very soon.
There have also been reports of strikes in Russian-held territories, areas around the border with Ukraine, an oil depot in Crimea, 2 trains derailed. It doesn't look good for the military leadership. You also had Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin recently calling for more ammunition for his fighters in Bakhmut. He even threatened at one point to pull his fighters out. Is the military leadership also in trouble?
Well, yes and no. They are in trouble because they're not winning. But those strikes, by the way, that you suggested actually confirm at least for the propaganda that this is the Kremlin strikes were also by the Ukrainian side. And therefore, it actually once again strengthens Putin's argument is that, look, they're striking against us everywhere with all these Western shiny weapons. So how can you even argue that we should really retreat and change our behavior? No, the military is not doing well. But Prigozhin, with his it seemed like it was a good play on his part. He's going to embarrass everybody, and because he's so needed, suddenly it's going to change everything in his favor. Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen fighter, the Chechen president, who is sort of rogue man along with Prigozhin, first said, well, we're going to take over. But then he went against Prigozhin too and said, well, you should have finished your job. Prigozhin said he's going to withdraw on the 10th of May. He's not withdrawing on the 10th of May. So once again, yes, there's absolutely sign of cacophony and disconnect within the elites, within the army. It still doesn't mean that Russia is losing to the point of having completely lost the war. It's just that discombobulation that in fact may allow the war to go for longer and longer and longer.
But let's get back to the public and what their opinion is and whether or not that might be changing. Because in Russia, some pro-war bloggers, they're actually warning now that Russia's front line could collapse in the face of a Ukrainian counteroffensive. There seems to be growing anxiety over the capabilities of forces. Combine that with U.S. estimates that some 20,000 Russians have died so far, and that's just in Bakhmut alone, according to those estimates. What is the mood right now in Russia? Is it turning?
No, not really. I mean, no, it's just such a case of wishful thinking, because it was already, in fact, the bloggers, the military bloggers, as you may remember, about 6 months ago, it was kind of the same anger and saying, well, we need to push, we need to do more. Then it subsided. Now it's rising up again.
Okay, but we've also parallel to that. We've seen Russia releasing a new foreign policy concept at the end of March, a radical departure from the previous foreign policy concept. For the first time since the Cold War, the Kremlin has formally made clear that it sees Washington as its main adversary, which you alluded to there. It has also had this sweeping goal that it's announced, that it is a Eurasian power. Could this bring more disruption and conflict? That's what the International Crisis Group is saying. What do you expect?
A completely fictional, psychotic national goal. I mean, it's kind of 13th century suddenly in the 21st, which has been that whole war and the whole Putin idea altogether is sort of the pan-Slavic state, because they talk about the unique civilization, which, in fact, even in the Cold War would be an insult, because in the Cold War, especially after Stalin's death, the idea was that that the socialist system is actually part of the global system. Now Russia officially says we are a unique thing, that we are going to, basically very Stalin, that it's a Putinism and one separately taking country. I don't imagine Russia going further than it does Ukraine. And even in today's speech, Putin said, we are defending the Donbass. I mean, he didn't even say we are defending the whole Ukraine. He said, the Ukrainian people, and we're defending the Donbass. So they keep, even with the sweeping goals of having Russia as a separate civilization, their geographical claims are, I don't want to say modest, because they are not, but they are not sweeping. What thing they're concerned about is the Russian world, what they say, Ruski mir. They're concerned about the Russian world, not necessarily in geographical terms, but in kind of this in intellectual terms, in psychological terms, in cultural terms, and so on. So no, I wouldn't see the army going further. However, I also don't see the army retreating in a peaceful solution. The army may be retreating, being forced back, but not because they decide to withdraw.
Can neighboring states, though, really feel safe? Because according to leaked U.S. documents recently, the Wagner Group was apparently involved in an alleged Kremlin-led effort to foment civil unrest in Moldova in the hopes of destabilizing that pro-Western government. How concerned should countries like Moldova be, and how much damage is Putin still capable of?
Well, I mean, the countries like Moldova should be concerned, because the countries like Moldova, they have Romanian language now as the official language. So the more drastic the countries are against Putin's Russia, the more damage, I don't know, they have military damage, but they are not going to subside their effort to make sure, once again, that their Russian world, the Ruski mir, the more Ruski mir is in danger. So the Russian world is in danger. So yes, I mean, the more drastic anti-Russian sentiment is, the more Putin is not going to give up idea to influence it one way or another.
I'd like to take it back to the domestic situation within Russia right now, where, as we mentioned, you have spent months of the war. In the headlines, we see opposition figures like Navalny, like Kara-Murza in jail, and yet you have spoken previously about the silent majority resisting in Russia. What evidence have you observed of that?
Well, I mean, I just look at the numbers and I try to read the polls, and so 45% of the Russian population say they support the war, or they are not against the war. 25% of those people are actually actively supporting it. The other 55 may or may not be. Let's remember that all of this, when they ask you a question, the polling is asking you a question, you know that your potential no, that I'm not supporting the special military operation, can lead to arrest, can lead to administrative punishment, and so on and so forth. So you really have to be quite courageous. But also, and I actually tell the story elsewhere, it's a silent majority, and that's what I mean by silent majority, is that you go into a bookstore, there's all these very patriotic books of how great Russia is and, whatnot. And then in the middle of all this incredible display of patriotism, you'll have a George Orwell mug sitting right in the middle of it and says, let the good brother think that that's C in this mug. So I buy this mug because I'm thinking, what an incredible thing. And then I come back a few days later and there's another George Orwell mug. So it's not just a random mug that was put there. It was put there as a message. I mean, you can see yellow and white arrangements all over Moscow somewhere. I mean, they're not necessarily, you wouldn't know who made them, but they're there. The flowers are arranged this way, or the colors are arranged this way somehow. So it's all there. But as I said, I mean, I left first in January, and in January, the mood was not militaristic. The war was elsewhere. I mean, there was still life going on. Now the billboards, the anger that we are not winning, we are not losing, our life is completely finished, essentially the way it was. So we might as well, we just have to rally around the flag. And that I said, I mean, that anger, the authorities are absolutely ratcheting up just because their message is, if you are not with us, you're going to be a defeated country. Do you want that? And many, many more Russians now, more and more Russians say, well, actually, no, because we don't know what it is to be a defeated country. Maybe it is scary. Maybe we have to at least pretend that we support it.
So, I mean, you've talked about how this war has strengthened the Ukrainian identity. What has happened to Russian identity?
I mean, that kind of nationalistic formula when Putin says, well, the whole country supports it. Well, no, I mean, the 1.5 million at least left. I mean, I write this in articles and people want evidence and they always correct me, like, well, 500,000. No, because if you put together all the countries that receive thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of Russians, probably 1.5 million, and I'm actually being very modest here, left. So clearly not. I mean, it's a over 1%, almost 2% of the Russian population. So not everybody supports, and it's completely fragmented identity. People are everywhere. Opposition is fighting. I mean, the opposition who stayed, the opposition who left, they are fighting amongst each other. And also Russia is now incredibly divided. I mean, Putin did more division to Russia than Donald Trump ever managed to do in the United States, because it's this kind of the khaki color, the military fatigue identity, which is required and requested. And another one is, now the Russians call it, is the person in a white coat. So, above the frail and saying, we're above all this. So it's dispersed and fragmented identity that some require extreme nationalism and some just say we have to survive.
I'd like to ask you to weigh in on these reports of a so-called reawakening of totalitarian instincts right now in Russian society, with people informing on each other, like in the Stalin era. The opposition, as we've mentioned, silenced, jailed, in exile. What sort of Russian society do you think emerges from this war?
I mean, we those of us, I mean, I know every time I say we cry every day, I'm told, well, Ukrainians are also crying. I'm actually not a fan of collective punishment, so we're allowed to cry too, as Russians. And it's, it is lost. It's going to go through cleansing and mea culpa, and how dare you malign Russia in any possible way, divisions for decades to come. So, I mean, it really is something that it's not just the reawakening of totalitarianism, because totalitarianism, even earlier totalitarianism, what the formulas of that totalitarians were still formulas that suggested that even with drastic measures, we are moving forward. We're moving towards something that may make it better. Where Russia is moving now, it really just all these formulas of the 13th century closed soon to be imperial power, as it was in the 13th century. Now it is, we want to go back to being an imperial power. So I cannot envision that. The only thing I keep saying is that George Orwell in 1994 has really, Russia is such now that George Orwell hasn't invented it. He couldn't have invented what's going on. It's George Orwell 2022 with an absolutely horrible consequences of this war.
How do you think society, Russian society, eventually will move past the horrors committed in Ukraine, the allegations of war crimes, including forced deportation of children, rape, torture? Do you hope that the change will happen and happen anytime soon?
I don't know. I really don't know, because I don't know how societies get over war crimes. I mean, we have an example of Germany, but it's a rare example. It's more an exception than it is the rule. So I really don't know. And that's why I think that when I talk about the anger that is rising up, it's exactly that, is that, well, since they're going to eliminate us, we're going to get angry and more nationalistic. And that's what I think Putin is relying on. How it's going to, it depends on what the opposition leader, if the opposition leaders come back. It depends on how the war will end. It depends on who will replace Putin, because eventually it will happen. He's a 70-year-old man. It all depends on so many things. Donald Rumsfeld, the late Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush, was saying so many unknowns that I really cannot speculate on that.
There are some that are saying that the war may last well into next year, if not longer. Does Putin have another year? Is time on his side in this war?
In a war of attrition, yes, the time on his side. As I said, I actually think that the longer it goes, the less questions he would have to answer. If it's not a complete loss, if it's not a complete, they running out of all ammunition altogether, as Prigozhin kept suggesting. I actually, at the beginning of this war, and probably even on that program, I said that it's a new Afghanistan. It's going to last for a long time. I don't see the victory in it. I mean, once again, many unknowns. I don't see victory of it. So it's going to be a long war of attrition until it can no longer continue. So I would even imagine it goes into next year, and maybe some remnants of it, or maybe a full scale of it even further and further. I really don't think we can know. I mean, they've been at the beginning, it was, 2 weeks, and then until January this year, and then until the spring, and then until the summer. It keeps going on. And so far, Russia is not winning is the way it wants, and Ukraine is not losing enough to really want to do something else. And so it's a Mexican standoff, essentially. It's a horrible, horrible Mexican standoff with many, many thousands of people dying all the time.
Your great-grandfather took power in Russia after Stalin died, and then he left office in what was a peaceful transfer of power at the time. It was certainly not a foregone conclusion that would happen at that time. How do you think Putin's presidency might eventually end?
So many unknowns. I don't know. I mean, it depends on the war. It depends on how long the Russians, whether the anger of the Russian society, sort of this whole khaki color patriotism, khaki color identity will win over others who are saying, well, we want Russia to be global. We don't want some pan-Slavic state that is slowly turning into North Korea. No, it's not a given. Actually, it's more Khrushchev and Gorbachev were more essentially flukes in Russian history than they are reality. I mean, traditionally, possibly after Putin, there would be some sort of a reform, but it's not a given. I mean, it could be, for example, you ask about the military bloggers and others and Prigozhin, it could be a military coup. I mean, Russia never had history of military coups, but all can happen. It could be that kind of a revolution when the hardline, not just the hardliners, but these really very militant forces will come to power and say, well, they're not taking us into this 13th century imperial grandeur fast enough. That's where we want to be. So it could be a revolution from the right. It could be, I don't see a revolution from other forces, from kind of liberal force. Actually, there's a right. And anyway, I don't see a revolution from the liberal forces. I potentially see a revolution from the hardliners and military forces. But once again, many unknowns here, possibly, but probably not soon enough.
In September, Alexei Navalny warned post-war Russia, like post-Putin Russia, will be doomed to become belligerent and Putinist again. Only a parliamentary republic can prevent this. How high are your hopes that Russia can eventually move beyond Putin and Putinism?
Not high. Not high. And Russia tried, by the way, parliamentary republic. I think Yeltsin had some sort of an idea about this, Boris Yeltsin, and then it didn't work out anyway, because vertical of power, that top, the power from the Kremlin, that personalized presidency as it is of Putin, that where everybody depends on him and their decisions, even if he's not giving direct orders to everybody, is pretty much of a Soviet system. In fact, when Khrushchev came in, it was a collective government. And very soon, it was Khrushchev on top. So this is a personalized Kremlin power at all times. So I don't have very high hopes for better development after Putinism.
We have to leave it there. Nina Khrushcheva, thank you so much for joining us on Conflict Zone. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.